We'll go from here in Libya. We have assembled a panel of experts to give us some analysis into the crisis in Libya. Ibrahim Shakia is the Deputy Director of the Brookings Doha Center in Qatar. Ayu Johnson is Director of Viewpoint Africa and a specialist on African affairs. He joins us from London. And Richard Weiss is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at Hudson Institute in Washington. And let me start with Ibrahim. So do you think the extension of NATO's military campaign in Libya by another 90 days will be enough to knock Gaddafi out of power? Ibrahim?
Yes, thank you very much for this. This is a good question. It seems what we understand that the NATO is determined to complete the job, and that for that particular reasons we have seen an extension for 90 days. It is based on the developments on the ground. It seems probably that there are more defections on the Gaddafi side, and this is going to weaken the regime significantly for the coming days. So probably the coming 90 days we are going to see some sort of a solution for the crisis in Libya. But let's keep in mind that with the extension of the NATO does not say that this will be the last one. So that they leave the door open, and based on the developments on the ground, I think that they will continue to assess how the situation is going.
And Richard, is it really the mission of NATO has already been changed? Do you think it is still to protect civilians, or it has been set to have a regime change in Libya? Richard?
Well, all the governments of NATO signed on to protecting the civilians of Libya from the government, and that's been supported in the UN. Now, not all of them have signed on to the idea that requires removal of Gaddafi from power, but the most important allies involved in the campaign, that is Britain and France, have said statements to that effect. So de facto, that means that you have to remove Gaddafi, in their view, to protect the civilians. And there's not a strong opposition within NATO to prevent that from taking the dominant tone of the campaign.
And Ayu, we have seen several defections from the Libyan government, the oil minister, the foreign minister, and it seems that the Gaddafi's command structure has been damaged. So what kind of effect it will have on Gaddafi's ruling of his government? Mr. Johnson?
It will have a significant effect. I think Gaddafi is struggling. He's been repeatedly bombed for a protracted period of time. His military machine has taken a serious battering, and the exposure and the defections that we're seeing within his inner circle is an indication that he is crumbling from within. And it wouldn't surprise us if we were to see further defections. The question is this: for those individuals who defect, the question is, if they're treated kindly by the West, if they're provided some level of support and protection from any form of conviction or prosecution, then it will send the sort of signals that we're seeing currently for others to defect, and Mr. Gaddafi will find himself in difficulty. But we've seen over time that Gaddafi is still there. He's quite strong, but the problems are quite severe because the rebels are not strong enough to defeat him, and he himself is clearly too weak to defeat them. So the stalemate situation we find ourselves can only lend a hand to himself, but more so it applies excessive pressure on the coalition, especially that of Britain, France and America, who have chosen to go for the knockout blow and take Gaddafi and his regime completely out.
As you said, Gaddafi is still very strong and also defiant, although there are enormous pressure from both outside and from within. So what do you think it will take to get him out?
Well, I think a couple of things. Firstly, Gaddafi would have realized by now that this will be a battle that he will have to fight to the bitter end. Or if he were to choose the other option of a third country, a safe country, You have countries like South Africa, who are part of the African Union. As we do know, Gaddafi has a long-established relationship with the African Union, being a former leader of the organization. But more so, if you were to go all the way to play countries like Venezuela, Brazil, he could get sanctuary from that. But I think for Gaddafi personally, is how much of a protection can he get from the international community, especially so when we see currently where the International Criminal Court have indicted him, and he's now, there's a warrant of an arrest out to get him. So it becomes very difficult as to where he can go, who would offer him protection, and how much of his inner circle would actually go with him. So it's a difficult call for him. He would like to negotiate his way out of trouble, but the problem is the NATO inner circle, especially that of France, Britain, and America, are not prepared to accept that. And the rebels in Benghazi, or the opposition as is otherwise known now, would not sit down and talk with Gaddafi at all. So it's a difficult call for all concerned, I'd say.
It's a difficult course, of course, and for Gaddafi himself, if Gaddafi refuses to step down, what other options remain for him? If Gaddafi prefers to go abroad to take some refuge, what do you think of the countries that might accept him? Ibrahim.
Thank you. Actually, this is becoming a more difficult question now for Gaddafi to accept, because the diplomatic solution has been seriously complicated with the first day of the mobilization of the ICC. We know that the Turkish leadership tried seriously in order to provide a solution, a diplomatic solution, and they tried on that for several times. And then we have seen that the outcome of the diplomatic efforts of the leadership of Turkey is that made it clearly that the ICC complicated the situation and prevented a diplomatic solution for the conflict. So really, we have seen also other attempts by South Africa president and by others like on the Russia side, but it's really with the ICC and with other complications that are on the ground now. It's becoming, the diplomatic solution becoming increasingly more difficult. So, because you need to ask what type of solution is that going to be. We know that now he's indicted, he's will be pursued even if he leaves power. So what country is going to accept him to be, to take the problem after his departure? This is going to be a very serious challenge for all the countries that might be willing to accept him. We know that there are friends or some sort of friendship that he has with some African Union countries and with a country like Venezuela. I think, before some of these countries would extend a commitment or an acceptance to host them, to host Gaddafi and his regime, is going to have to receive some sort of guarantees from either from the rebels or from the international community. And I highly doubt whether the international community or the rebels leadership in Benghazi would be willing to provide such an extension. That's one. On the other hand, we're not only talking about al-Qaddafi and his children and his sons. We're talking about the entire regime. This is an entrenched regime, and regime that has been fighting so strongly for the past couple of months. And if Gaddafi were to leave, it's not only about him and his family. It's about the entire regime. Who is going to accept the entire regime? That makes the diplomatic solution way more complicated than finding a solution. What this means, we are left with solutions like defeating on the ground or surrender or some sort of that solution.
Well, obviously, the diplomatic solution is still underway, and most of the diplomatic negotiations are now going through the African Union, and it is also Colonel Gaddafi's wish. It is efforts repeatedly fizzle out on the other hand. So what role do you think AU, African Union, can play in this scenario? Mr. Johnson?
I think the African Union has a role to play. The question is that they've played several roles over the many years. We saw clearly when they went to Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, where their delegation there did not achieve anything. And of course, we're seeing in Libya now, where we've seen excessive more high-profile delegations being sent, presidents with distinction going there to negotiate Gaddafi's way out of trouble, but coming out empty-handed. So I think the longer this goes on, the African Union will find itself in far more difficulty for people to accept their credibility is at stake. And it will become far more difficult for them to rekindle their lost credibility than it would otherwise to oust Gaddafi or even install democracy in Libya. So the African Union have got to start saying what they mean and mean what they say, and for people to respect that. And we've not seen that so far. So it remains to be seen, be it that Gaddafi wants to do business with the African Union, be it that he's chosen the African Union over the Arab League, be it that the African Union are prepared to do so. But there are other stakeholders, especially Britain, France, and America, who would say otherwise. And it leaves always the case, the African Union in the bottom end, and they have always tried to fight their way out of trouble in terms of resolving the conflict. And we've not seen them achieve that previously, and it's becoming very difficult this time around.
Another important stakeholder is, of course, the U.S. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton plans to make a 3-day nation tour of Africa in the coming days, which will, of course, include a stop in Addis Ababa and a talk about the Libya situation. So, Richard, what do you think it is going to gain from her visit of Clinton?
Well, I think some of it will be to try and rally support for the campaign. But some of it's probably going to be exploring opportunities for some kind of negotiated settlement through the AU. I mean, if you were going to think of obvious mediators, the AU would be one, Russia would be another possibility. China, in theory, though, the Chinese are trying to, I think, stay away from this conflict as much as possible. And I guess the UN could be the other one. So the AU, though, would be a natural way to figure out some kind of peaceful settlement, since Gaddafi has very strong connections with the AU, and the AU is trying to assert its role as an important player in managing regional security conflicts.
So when we know that Clinton is talking to African Union officials, do you think Gaddafi will be willing to accept any proposal by the EU if he suspects there could be some Western influences, especially those U.S. initiative?
I think you mean the AU, and yes, I think that I think it's understood. I mean, I think Gaddafi's probably aware that the U.S. has some influence with the AU. He might even have more, but then you start bringing in the Europeans and so on, so it's not clear. But again, AU is a logical institution to do this mediation effort.
And Mr. Johnson, how likely is the African Union to yield to U.S. pressure and maybe include some of the terms into the negotiations with Colonel Gaddafi? Mr. Johnson?
Yes, the African Union has got to show that they're independent. They're desperate to show that to the rest of the world. So any form of interference in their decision-making would not be treated kindly by the African Union. But I think the classic signs are he who pays the piper would always call the tune. And we have several stakeholders on the African continent, of which the Chinese, which is a most significant dominant player on the African continent, not to mention Brazil, Russia, and European interests. So I think Africans find themselves in a very unique position, and they realize that they can choose among all these different stakeholders. And I personally think that whoever controls Africa's resources, whoever can provide its resources in terms of financial support, whoever can help it in terms of its extraction of its minerals, would have all the support from the Africans and their respective organizations. So I personally think that as we see currently with China having the biggest stake on the African continent, they would have far more influence should they wish it. But I think that the Americans and Britons would have an influence on the African continent, especially that of the African Union. And from a diplomatic perspective, it would not want to be perceived as such, because African Union is desperate to show that it's independent, it's free, and it can make decisions on its own accord. And it's got to show that.
But of course, America wants the situation in Libya to develop the way that it wants. So what kind of leverage does America have over what is happening in Libya? Richard?
Well, there's a peculiar thing about this campaign is that it's not really as intensely felt or considered to be as important as those in Afghanistan or Iraq previously, or dealing with Iran's nuclear weapons. It's almost become an issue of doing enough to keep the allies happy. And that's an interesting inverse of what we see in Afghanistan, where we often see the Europeans figuring out what do they need to do to keep the Americans happy. So the U.S. has some leverage. It has key capabilities that it can offer. But this has really been a British-French-led effort from the beginning. And the United States is willing to support it because it agrees with goals. But getting rid of Gaddafi or keeping them there won't make much of a difference to U.S. security. It's more an issue for the Europeans and the Mediterranean states.
But of course, it's just not Libya. We have seen unrest in Syria, Yemen, and other Arab countries, especially Yemen. There is escalating fighting in Yemen now. So what do you think the end game will be in Libya, Ibrahim, and how will it affect what will be happening in the rest of the Arab countries and Mideast? Ibrahim?
Thank you. Thank you. I think that the end game of the situation in Libya is going to have very important and serious implications for what is going to happen in the rest of the Arab countries. On one hand, we know that Al-Qaddafi developed the first model since the Arab Spring started of resisting the revolution and confronting the protesters violently. So he has been taking this on for a couple of months now and trying to challenge and to quiet and to resist all the way to the end. His success in putting an end to this war on his term is going to empower the other leaders in the Arab world and to present a model that this is the way to deal with it. And this is going to encourage other leaders, such as in Yemen or in Syria or in other places, that if you challenge, if you defy, if you launch this kind of campaign, you're going to win and you're going to end it on your terms. However, the defeat of this model is going to provide an important lesson for other countries in the region that you can resist for a couple of months, you can engage in all sort of violent confrontation with the protesters, but for how long this is going to last? So it is going to affect them on the other way. And we have seen, or we heard reports that in Yemen that President Saleh has left already to Saudi Arabia. So probably he took a note of that. In addition, and overall, I think the way we're going to see an end to the Libya confronting and the Arab awakening is moving from here.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. We will keep a close watch. Ibrahim Shakia from Brookings Doha Center, and also Mr. Ira Johnson from Viewpoint Africa, and Mr. Richard Weiss from the Political Military Analysis of Hudson Institute in Washington. Thank you very much. And you are now watching World Insight. We'll be right back with more stories up next.